Everyone calls them the participation trophy generation, the entitled ones, the avocado toast crowd who killed everything from napkins to the housing market. Millennials, born roughly 1981 to 1996, have been analyzed, criticized, and memeified into oblivion. But here's what almost nobody talks about. Beneath all that supposed confidence and self-expression is a generation drowning in a very specific kind of anxiety that previous generations simply cannot understand. They're your coworkers who seem fine but are secretly spiraling. Your friends who post cheerful vacation photos while their savings account screams. The people who revolutionize side hustles not out of ambition, but out of pure economic terror. And here's the thing, their psychology isn't what you think it is. Let's start with something most people don't realize. Millennials were the first generation raised on the explicit promise that they were special. Not in a vague, you can be anything way, but in a systematic, institutionalized way. Teachers told them they were gifted. Parents documented their every achievement. Schools created elaborate reward systems for basic participation. A 2017 study in psychological science found that millennials scored significantly higher on measures of self-importance than previous generations at the same age. But here's the twist everyone misses. That wasn't confidence. It was a prison picture this. It's 1995. You're 10 years old and you just got picked for the spelling bee. Your parents are beaming. Your teacher says you're exceptional. You go home and there's a certificate with your name on it in fancy letters. Someone takes a photo. Maybe it goes in a scrapbook. The message was clear. You matter because you achieve. Your worth is measurable, displayable, shareable. Now fast forward. You're 25, you've got a college degree that costs more than your parents' first house, and you're working a job that has nothing to do with your major for $38,000 a year. The same society that told you that you were special is now asking why you haven't bought a home yet. Psychologists call this the expectation-reality gap. And for millennials, it's a chasm. They did everything right. They went to college because everyone said that's how you succeed. They took unpaid internships because that's how you get your foot in the door. They networked, they hustled, they optimized their LinkedIn profiles. And then the 2008 financial crisis hit just as the oldest millennials were entering the workforce. They watched the rules dissolve in real time. Their parents' generation could walk into an office with a resume and walk out with a career. Millennials sent out 200 applications and got ghosted. They were told they were overqualified, underexperienced, too expensive, not experienced enough, all in the same breath. Research from the Federal Reserve shows that millennials have 34% less wealth than previous generations had at the same age, despite being the most educated generation in history. Let that sink in. More degrees, less money, more qualifications, fewer opportunities. So they developed what looks like entitlement, but is actually hypervigilance. They job hop not because they're disloyal, but because loyalty stopped being a two-way street before they even entered the building. They demand work-life balance not because they're lazy, but because they watch their parents sacrifice everything for companies that laid them off with a severance package and a LinkedIn post. But here's where it gets really interesting. Millennials are the first generation to grow up with the internet, and that fundamentally rewired how they process identity and self-worth. Think about it. Every generation before them had a private self and a public self. You could fail at something, feel embarrassed, go home, and that was it. Maybe your friends knew, maybe your family knew, but it ended there. Millennials don't have that luxury. Their failures, their awkward phases, their questionable choices, they're archived forever. That photo from 2009, still out there. That tweet from college, someone screenshot it. That breakup, your ex's friends are still posting about it. A study in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology found that millennials experience what researchers call ambient awareness, a constant low-level consciousness of how they're being perceived by an invisible audience. It's not narcissism, it's surveillance anxiety. They curate their lives because they learned early that everything is a performance and someone is always watching. Instagram isn't vanity. It's a resume for your personality. LinkedIn isn't networking. It's proof you exist in a professional capacity. Twitter isn't conversation. It's a permanent record of your thoughts that could get you fired 5 years later. This created a paradox at the core of millennial psychology. They're the most connected generation in history and the loneliest. They have 800 Facebook friends and nobody to call at 2 a.m. when the anxiety hits, because here's what nobody prepared them for. Digital connection isn't the same as human intimacy. You can share your breakfast, your workout, your thoughts on the latest political crisis, and still feel completely isolated. The dopamine hit from a like doesn't fill the hole left by actual community. Studies show that millennials report higher rates of loneliness than any previous generation, despite having more ways to connect than ever before. They're texting constantly, but talking less. They're following hundreds of people, but being seen by none. And let's talk about their relationship with money, because it's deeply psychological. Millennials are simultaneously criticized for not saving enough and for being too frugal. They get roasted for spending on experiences instead of houses, but also for killing industries by not buying things. Here's what's actually happening. They came of age during the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. They watched retirement accounts evaporate. They saw parents lose homes. They graduated into a gig economy that treats workers as disposable. So they developed what economists call recession psychology, a deep mistrust of traditional markers of financial stability. They don't buy houses because they watched housing destroy their parents. They don't trust pensions because pensions don't exist anymore. They invest in experiences because experiences can't be repossessed. The YOLO mentality isn't recklessness. It's a rational response to economic instability. If you can't afford the future anyway, why not enjoy the present? But underneath that Instagram-worthy brunch is crushing financial anxiety. Research shows that 63% of millennials have less than $500 in savings. They're living paycheck to paycheck while their social media suggests they're thriving. The performance of success has become more important than actual success because the actual success feels impossible. Millennials invented the side hustle not because they're entrepreneurial by nature, but because one job doesn't pay the bills anymore. They're not pursuing their passions, they're monetizing their desperation. That Etsy shop, that's rent. That freelance writing, that's student loans. That DoorDash gig, that's health insurance they can't get any other way. And here's something that rarely gets discussed. Millennials have a fundamentally different relationship with authority than any generation before them. They don't automatically respect hierarchies. They question everything, not because they're rebellious, but because they grew up watching institutions fail. The church had scandals. The government lied about weapons of mass destruction. The financial system collapsed. The media got everything wrong. They learned that credentials don't equal competence, that titles don't guarantee integrity, that just because someone is in charge doesn't mean they know what they're doing. So when a millennial asks why in a meeting, they're not being difficult. They're asking because they genuinely need to understand the logic. When they push back on, "That's how we've always done it," it's not disrespect. It's a survival instinct developed from watching old systems fail catastrophically. But this questioning creates its own exhaustion. Living in a constant state of skepticism is mentally draining. Always needing to verify, always needing to fact check, always needing to see behind the curtain, it's exhausting. And then there's the mental health crisis nobody wants to fully acknowledge. Millennials are the therapy generation. They talk openly about anxiety, depression, burnout. Older generations see this as weakness. But here's the reality. They're not weaker. They're just the first generation to name what they're experiencing. Previous generations had the same mental health struggles. They just didn't have the language, the destigmatization, or the awareness to address it. They white-knuckled through it. They self-medicated. They suffered in silence. Millennials decided silence wasn't working. They went to therapy. They talked about it. They normalized it. And they got criticized for that too. There's something uniquely cruel about being told you're too sensitive for acknowledging the same struggles your parents' generation drowned in alcohol and workaholism. Here's what's fascinating, though. Despite all of this, the economic trauma, the surveillance anxiety, the loneliness, the financial instability. Millennials are also the generation most committed to making things better. They're more politically engaged than previous generations were at their age. They care about climate change, social justice, representation, equity, not because they're naive idealists, but because they've seen what happens when systems go unchecked. They're bringing their kids into a world they know is broken, and they're determined to fix it. Not because they think they can, but because they can't afford not to try. Millennials might be the most psychologically complex generation in modern history. Not better, not worse, just different. Shaped by contradictions, told they were special, then made to feel worthless. Given access to everything, afforded nothing. Connected to everyone, belonging nowhere. They're the generation caught between worlds. Too young to have benefited from the old economy, too old to be native to the new one. And maybe that's why they fight so hard, optimize so much, perform so constantly, because they're trying to build a bridge to a future that keeps getting further away. They're exhausted, anxious, and broke, but they're still here, still trying, still hoping that maybe, just maybe, things could be different.